Okay, Laurie, it's a pleasure to speak to you. Like I was saying, we want to kind of have a conversation with you about classical Chinese medicine, what that is, how it works, and what's so wonderful about it. Um, First things first, Yassin and I want to have this conversation from the perspective of patients, really. Um, we've both had the pleasure of receiving a classical Chinese medicine, and we found it to be wonderfully effective. Um, and we would like to know how you got into this in the first place, how you got into Chinese medicine, how you got into classical Chinese medicine, um, and any of the posts or positions that you occupy today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for setting this up. Looking forward to having this chat. Yeah, I mean, my sort of background and how I got into Chinese medicine isn't actually that interesting a story. I finished, I finished school, finished my A levels in this country, which is what you do before going to university. At age 18, and just kind of didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I was doing a bit of martial arts at the time. I kind of took a year out before thinking about what I wanted to do at uni. And then came across just this kind of short introductory course to Tuina, which is, the Chinese medical massage system, and Qigong, which is a sort of exercise system. So did this very short week-long sort of course. And from that, the person taking the course kind of introduced a lot of Chinese medical theory, and I kind of got very interested in it from that. Started reading around a bit. And then it turned out a friend of my sister's had been studying acupuncture at a college in London, and I wasn't even aware you could sort of study Chinese medicine, in this country. So at that point, I kind of became interested in that. I saw they had a Tuina program, so then I thought, I'll go and study there. So it's just one of those kind of quick decisions you make age 19, which I didn't really think about. I went along to see the college, and at the time, at the open day, they're talking about Tuina, about acupuncture, and at the time I was incredibly needle phobic. But I thought I may as well study acupuncture too while I'm there, and kind of stuck a needle in myself and realized it's very different hypodermic needles, and so at that point I thought, well, I've got over that bit of my needle phobia. So I may as well study acupuncture while I'm there, which is a very wise decision, I think, because Tuina is incredibly physically demanding. Some people are very, very good at it, but yeah, it's quite an exhausting thing to practice. So yeah, started studying acupuncture and Tuina. In this country, you study things, well, some colleges offer combined courses of, Tuina, acupuncture and herbs all together, but a lot of them don't. And the one I was at was a college that offered it all separately. And I never really thought about studying herbs. I thought it's something I may come back to later in life. But then towards the end of my acupuncture training, I thought, well, I may as well study herbs as well, get it done now. So I decided to do that as well. And I enjoyed the study, but this kind of feeds into the reason as to why I shifted to classical medicine. It's because along the kind of course of my studies, I started becoming quite disillusioned with the Chinese medicine that's taught, or at least that was taught to me. And this is something that will come up again and again. I found it really didn't have a cohesive theory that carried through to practice. The practice became very much protocol-based. As soon as you got into clinic, all the ideas of treating the patient as an individual and so on would just drop. It just became very protocol-based. You'd have certain protocols for certain Western medical diagnosis. And one of the things that was always kind of sold to us when we were studying acupuncture was, if you're studying herbs, that's a massive step up. And, to be a herbalist, you have to be really good. Your diagnosis has to be really good. Your treatments have to be really focused. That's not a mindset which I necessarily agree with, because with acupuncture, you can become safe and able to, stick needles in people with a day's training. Like, seriously, it's the bar to entry in acupuncture is very low, but to be a good acupuncturist is an immense level of skill. And I know a few very good acupuncturists, and yeah, so it's a phenomenal level of skill to be a good acupuncturist, but to be able to do it safely is a very, very low level. It's very low entry. And I think with herbs, the entry level is a little higher, but the skill level of being good is equal to being a good acupuncturist. So I'm not saying, you know, being a good acupuncturist is easy or something of lower value. It's definitely a very, very difficult skill to master, but the entry level is a bit like higher for herbs. And that was kind of the thing there. It's kind of like I sort of realized that was kind of the mindset, in that you can get away with whatever you like with acupuncture to a certain extent. With herbs, you've got to be a bit more careful. And that's kind of how it was sold. And I realized once I started studying herbs, there wasn't really this step up. Like we really didn't learn at a higher level of Chinese medicine. You just had to learn a bit more information to be safe. So I started getting even more disappointed, and kind of the question I had weren't really answered when I started studying herbs. I was quite young at the time, quite young, getting quite frustrated. And because this was very much the focus of my life, that I got a bit more and more frustrated with what I was learning. And I kind of started feeling like, I'm not really sure if I'm going to even practice this, Around the same time, I also started reading the Shang Han Lun, just line by line, reading a few like modern commentaries, not classical commentaries, but just like modern commentaries in modern translation. And I started seeing the commentaries didn't really make sense, but just something in the lines of the Shang Han Lun, there's something there which had been missing from my training. I felt that was where the truth kind of lay. There was an understanding of the mechanism of the body, the thing that Chinese medicine sort of always promised, but which wasn't really delivered in my kind of modern Chinese medical training. And then about midway through, maybe a bit after midway through my herbal training, I came into contact with my current teacher, Arnaud Versluys, who is a lineage holder of a classical Shang Han Lun lineage. And it was a bit of an enlightenment, within the first 5-10 minutes of hearing speak, it was a lot of the questions which I had. He kind of started to answer or allude to the answers. And I started to see a very, very systematic approach, a very methodical approach, and something that actually fit with the principles of Chinese medicine, which we always talk about, the basic principles of yin yang, 5 elements, and how that carried all the way through to treatment. So that I started to realize this is actually where what was promised to me when starting Chinese medicine lay in the classics. So yeah, after that point, I kind of threw myself into it. I even tried to practice that way in the student clinic, which didn't always go down well. The results went down a lot better, I've got to say, but the actual trying to practice that way didn't go down well. I was actually warned by a lot of the lecturers at the college not to study one particular style, not to commit to one style, which is something I think we'll maybe talk about a bit later. Yeah, but after I finished college, it was like I was very happy to be out there, and then I could just focus on studying this. And basically since then, the last 15 or so years, I've basically been studying the Tian lineage of Shang Han Lun practice pretty much exclusively. I think since about 2010, 2011, I've been teaching the Tian lineage in Europe, a little bit in Australia as well. Yeah, both lectures, both the theoretical aspect and the clinical aspect. And been in clinical practice since that time as well. And I actually, must be about 10 years ago now that I stopped practicing acupuncture completely, because I just basically I found this is a herbal lineage, and I found I didn't really have an acupuncture system that matched this methodical approach. I found the results kind of weren't really there for me in acupuncture. So I reached a point where I realized I've got to go one of two ways. I've either got to find a teacher and a system for acupuncture, which allows me to practice in as, clear and methodical a way, or I've got to stop. And it was at that point where I thought, do I want to divide my resources, time and my very limited money, between the two, or do I want to focus exclusively on herbal medicine? And my feeling was I want to focus exclusively on herbal medicine. So that's basically what I've done since then.
I mean, there's a lot of things that I think as a patient, I can say, you know, about this, the sort of the approach that TCM has versus the approach that for the past maybe 2 years, I've had a very different experience as a patient with the classical medicine. And there's a lot of resonances from the other side in terms of what you're saying. Um, but I'd like to kind of start from the top, from the, you know, with the most general questions, and then work our way down to some case studies and examples that show us what you mean. But my first question, I think, would be, what did you find? What have you found is the fundamental difference for you between a classical medicine, TCM, and maybe even allopathic medicine, just in their approach to problem solving or to looking at a patient and understanding what's going with them?
Yeah, there's a lot there. First, I do want to say, like, I don't want to bash TCM at all. Some people find it's the thing for them. Some people are able to work out an effective method from it. And if, you know, if that's for you, then go for it. And there's some very effective practitioners out there who do TCM. So I don't want to bash it, you know, but let's maybe start with the difference between allopathic medicine and Chinese medicine in general. And again, neither of these are positives or negatives. I think they're just they're two different approaches, both of which are incredibly valuable and incredibly necessary as well. A lot of what you'll hear is, you know, Chinese medicine looks at the whole person, Western medicine looks at the disease and so on. That kind of is true. I mean, basically you can say that this fundamentally comes down to the kind of Western sort of scientific approach versus the classical Chinese scientific approach. When I say the classical Chinese scientific approach, I mean the ways in which early man in that region of the world tried to work out the laws of the universe. So early Chinese scientific theory was basically yin-yang theory, which is a theory of, you know, two opposing poles almost, and how everything else fits in relative to those two things. And that then became divided up into smaller and smaller divisions, such as 5 elements and 6 conformations. So you have the division of something into its two extreme opposite poles of yin and yang. And then from that, you can divide that further into, say, 5 elements, which is basically a description of the extreme pole of yang, the extreme pole of yin, which is fire and water. And then the movement from yin to yang and yang to yin. And the movement from yin to yang is the wood element. The movement from yang to yin is the metal element. And then what sits in the middle, the central point around which this happens, is the earth element. So it's basically dividing these two, or dividing up these two opposing poles into smaller and smaller divisions, so you can start to kind of understand everything in that structure, if you see what I mean. And this was the way everything was understood at that time. You know, it's the way you understood agriculture, the way you understood weather, the way you understood the physical layout of the earth, and also the way you understood the human body. The current kind of Western scientific thought, you know, comes out of sort of Enlightenment era thought, where it becomes very, you know, what you call rational, which is, you know, comes from the idea of ratios, of weighing and measuring, of physical absolutes, and less about things in relation to other things. So the classical Chinese thought is always looking at something in relation to something else. The Western thought is analyzing something very much by itself, in and of itself, like something has a specific size, shape, a specific molecular weight. It is what it is. Whereas in Chinese medicine, something is only what it is relative to something else. So, you know, is your head high up? Yes, it's high up in relation to your feet, but in relation to the sky, it's low down, you know. So, whereas from a Western medical perspective, your head is a certain measurement, a certain weight, and that's what it always is, regardless of anything else around it, you know. So it's that idea that it's analyzing absolutes versus looking at things in relation to each other. And you can say also that Western medicine could be looked at very much, the microscope is a very good example. You're zooming in and looking at things in absolute detail. In Chinese medicine, you do the opposite. You would zoom out and you would look at everything in relation to one another. When this comes to medical practice, Chinese medicine understands a disease as an interaction between a person's constitution and whatever disease-causing factor, whether it be an external influence or whether it be an internal lifestyle factor. But it's always an interaction between the two. So you don't get these absolutes of this person has this disease, which is always treated with this pharmaceutical, which will block this pathway or so on. You would look at somebody, regardless of what their primary symptom would be or what their biomedical disease name would be, you would look at the whole constellation of their symptoms and how the pathological process relates to the constitution of their body. And that's why every patient in Chinese medicine who has a similar presenting primary condition may come out with very, very different treatments. But then you also may end up using the same treatment, the same, say, herbal formula for two people with completely different diseases, if their corresponding underlying pathology is the same. I don't know if that kind of.
It does. I think I have two questions. One is, would you say that part of that is, we talked about things being relative to each other, and we've looking at the whole pattern, as opposed to sort of zoning in on a very specific piece of minutia. Would you say that looking at a process rather than looking at anything else is something that is different between those two ways of thinking?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a very, very good point. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that would be another very good example that Chinese medicine also looks at change. Again, it doesn't look at fixed states. It looks at how things change from one to another. And actually, there's this saying which is often, or this passage from the Neijing, one of the classical texts, which is always quoted that, wind is the cause of the 100 diseases and wind represents change. And a lot of people read that as kind of, in a larger philosophical sense, as the inability to change, the inability to continue on a constantly changing state as the body should be, and you get stuck in a certain way. And this is something we may talk about later when we talk about theory, that a lot of Chinese medical tools are that the kind of theoretical framework is there to understand constant change. And it's when that change is disrupted. So yeah, you're always looking at that, and a diagnosis is more saying where that person is stuck now, how it's not changing properly. But also from that, you can understand where a disease will be likely progressing to, where it will likely have come from. So there is very much that element as well of looking at more of a dynamic picture rather than a fixed state.
So can I ask you, and it may be difficult at this point, so if you like, we can come back to it later, but I find this really interesting that you say, and it really has been my experience with me and some of my friends and family, that I've sent to TCM people and been successfully treated, and to classical Chinese medicine people and been successfully treated. This idea that a person, two people who seem to have the same biomedical thing can be given two different formulas, and can you give us just a brief example of that and why that would be the case? I go in, I have a cold or I have a flu. Why would you give one person one herbal formula, another person one herbal formula? What would prompt that to make it concrete?
I mean, it basically comes down to, let's say we have a flu virus. The same two people are subject to the same flu virus. Why would they not get the same treatment? Well, this is the thing. In Western medical perspective, they're trying to knock out the virus, which is fair enough. A Chinese medical perspective, I don't really care what you've been subject to. I care how it's affected the function of your body. So two people whose bodies are functioning in a very different way, so they have a very different constitutional makeup, they will be affected differently by that same virus. The flip side is, if you both come in and you've been affected in the same way, you get the same treatment. But a lot of the time, people will have those variations. Say if it's somebody, like a young a young woman who already, tends to be very, very cold, very exhausted and so on. When she gets this flu virus, she just doesn't mount any kind of fever. She's just left completely exhausted, develops a really phlegmy cough and so on. It goes to her chest quickly, develops a really phlegmy cough and so on, versus, an older guy who mounts a really, really big fever and sweating relentlessly and boiling hot. They're two completely different physiological reactions. What we're always trying to do, at least with classical Chinese medicine, is support the body's physiology so it can regain its correct function. We're not trying to knock out pathology. We're never trying to fight pathology. We're trying to support physiology so it can regain correct physiological function. Now, if somebody came into contact with a flu virus and were not affected by it, they wouldn't be ill from a Chinese medical perspective. If their function wasn't changed, they wouldn't be ill. So those two people are affected in very, very different ways. So giving them the same treatment doesn't make sense from a Chinese medical perspective because the disease they present are two different diseases, basically.
So what you're saying is you're defining the disease as the particular imbalance that's happening in one person's body rather than naming it after whatever virus caused that imbalance.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So that, I think, tells us a little bit about Chinese medicine in general and allopathic medicine. Is there a difference then between a classical Chinese medicine and TCM? And if there is, what's responsible for that difference, since conventional wisdom is Chinese medicine, right?
Yeah, this is where it can get potentially very confusing for somebody who's new to this, because TCM, there's TCM translated as traditional Chinese medicine, but it's not actually traditional at all. So Chinese medicine has a long history. It's gone through many periods of theoretical development, but around 2,000 years ago, certain texts known as the classics were written. These were kind of the foundational texts. So they went through a lot of different development of theories, trying out many different theories. And eventually, about 2,000 years ago, they settled on what they found to be the most cohesive, consistent theoretical model. And that was written down in texts called the classics. And they're the foundational texts. They're the foundational theories upon which Chinese medicine is built. Classical Chinese medicine basically means practicing according to the classics, according to how Chinese medicine is done in the classics. Now, in the 2,000 years since then, there have been many different schools that have sprung up, just partly for practical reasons, like somebody will have learned something, because also classical Chinese medicine isn't just one school. There are still many different ways of applying the classics, but the unifying fundamental principles are still the same. But out of that, you have like one person may practice a certain way, teach that style to another person. Somebody else may have focused on a different aspect and taught that to somebody else. And then you could have geographical reasons. So, somebody in a very hot, dry part of the country will see a tendency of different kind of diseases than somebody in a very cold part of the country. So that will have changed. Also, the kind of herbs you have access to will be different across the country. And, China's a vast landmass, so you're going to get big differences. And then over time, you see as international trade opened up, more epidemic diseases came in. So then you get certain other schools developing with a focus on epidemics. Certain other schools develop maybe, I don't know, if one practitioner practiced among the rich affluent classes, they're more likely to see diseases of affluence, so they'll develop a certain school. So over the last 2,000 years, people develop different theories based on what they tend to see, what they were taught, and so on. So many different schools developed over that time. Then in more recent times, there was and when I say more recent times, the last few hundred years, there was an attempt to start to integrate, pretty early Western medical theory into Chinese medicine, and kind of correlate Western anatomy with Chinese medicine, which isn't to say that classical Chinese medicine didn't have a really good understanding of anatomy. They did. They just, looked at it again in a very different way. But there's quite detailed anatomical writing. So you'd need to really talk to somebody who's a classical acupuncturist to talk more about that. But, they started to try and integrate a lot of Western medical ideas and so on. But then came, the Cultural Revolution, where a lot of what was seen to be traditional Chinese was thrown out, basically, especially anything that was seen to have kind of spiritual roots, which there was a lot of, spirituality combined within Chinese medicine. Also, again, coming back to a difference between Western and Chinese medicine uses quite, seemingly poetic, metaphorical language often. And they do that so they can say a simple phrase which can be opened up to mean a vast number of things depending on what it's in relation to. So again, it sounds very flowery, poetic, or that, you know, that can often be interpreted in certain pseudo-spiritual way. So, you know, so there's all of these things. And then also, you know, there was that idea that, you know, Mao really wanted to modernize China, wanted to really take it into, you know, Western scientific methods. But then he hit a bit of a snag in that he realized he didn't have a massive amount of money, but he had a massive population who were getting quite sick. So it's like, oh, I need a medical system. I need to provide medicine for a lot of these people, and I need to train up a lot of doctors very quickly. And then he realized we've got this, you know, vast history of medicine. We need to use it. So then Chinese medicine was then basically developed into what is now TCM, which is basically a curriculum to get people to a very, you know, a certain standard of competence very, very quickly. But it taught in a kind of mass education setting, because traditionally Chinese medicine was always passed down teacher to student. You had specific lineages which focused on one thing or another, and the lineage system was always very, very traditional. You know, the teacher taught, the student learned, and there wasn't a lot of back and forth. And this idea of like following a single teacher, a single person doesn't really fit within a communist model. So they couldn't, when they're creating TCM for a start, they had many different schools, and they were like, well, we can't pick one school over the other. We can't say one has more value, you know. We have to look at everything with equal value. We have to kick out anything that has any really kind of spiritual, even psycho-spiritual connotations. So there was this kind of idea of like writing this curriculum which integrated all schools of thought as much as possible, or at least didn't value one above the other, but also just got people to a level where they could provide some basic level of healthcare very, very quickly. I think the first curriculum was like 2 years or so. And this is what kind of led to like the training of the barefoot doctors and so on. So that's what TCM was. It was developed out of two things, one out of a practical need, and second out of a political philosophy as well. And we've got to remember those two things. TCM was never meant to be this gold standard of medicine. It was meant to fulfill the need of getting people trained up very, very quickly so they could stop people from, you know, dying, or at least provide some very basic level of medical care. But yeah, that's second. Yeah, like that second thing of integrating all styles. It wasn't really an integration as such. It was just kind of lumping them in together. And that's kind of a bit of an issue with TCM in that I think in many ways, and TCM has evolved a bit since that point, but that basic structure, I think in many ways, what it would serve as is a very good kind of, it could be condensed down, what is taught nowadays, into a very good sort of 1 year introduction. Then after that, you go off and specialize. But the problem is now people are kind of taught this thing that was originally never meant to be this high standard. But they're now taught this thing which is just a mishmash of all different systems with no context for each individual system. And I'm not necessarily saying that each individual, you know, that any one system is better than any other. You know, I practice a particular lineage of Shang Han Lun practice. I personally feel that's what suits me best. So I will personally say I feel that's the best, obviously, but I don't think other people have to think that. But there are many other schools of Shang Han Lun. You know, there's the Wenbing schools, warm disease schools, many different branches of that. You know, there was like the Jingyuan period with the spleen stomach school, you know, Judanshi stuff, many different lineages. And when that's all lumped together with no context, it becomes so eclectic that people don't really understand the context of each individual bit of information.
Yeah, I think as a patient, what I found was the best practitioners, and again, this is just my personal experience. The best practitioners, you know, there's plenty of very good TCM practitioners, but I found that the best ones leave school and then pick up a part of that, and really dive into it, and they become very, very effective, and seems to me more satisfied as practitioners. But what do I know? I'm not a practitioner. But this, I think, is a really good point. To dive a little bit into the lineage that you practice, which is the Tian lineage. Dr. Arnaud Versluys is your teacher, I believe. He's the lineage holder. um, for that system, and it's the Tian system. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Um, can you give us then, we've talked about sort of how we think about classical medicine. There's this relationship between sort of you as a thing and the universe as a thing, and then a process and things being relative to each other in that classical sort of Chinese way. Can you tell us then some of the ideas in the system that you practice that kind of demonstrate that broad philosophical outlook and kind of brings us down halfway to the clinic, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the first and most important thing I'll say about the Tian lineage is it's a clinical lineage. Like the fundamental principle about it is that it is a clinical lineage and it revolves around clinical practice. The theory is there to help the understanding of clinical practice, but it is a clinical lineage. That's the first and most important thing to understand. To give you a bit of background about the specific lineage, so it's called the Tian lineage because it comes from the Tian family, who are practicing in Chengdu. And basically, my teacher Arnaud studied with Dr. Zeng Rongxiu, who was a student of Dr. Tian Heming, who's seen as like the patriarch of the lineage. He learned from his teacher, Tian Chitai, who's his brother or his older brother or his cousin. How everyone kind of calls everyone brother in China. So, but they were close family relatives. But basically, they learned a pulse system from somewhere. That's going back quite a few generations, so we don't have great records on where it came from before that. But basically, the Tian family learned a pulse system, would treat hundreds and hundreds of people, and Tian Heming was recorded as treating between 200 to 300 people a day from age 18 up until the day that he died at age 98. And he basically, he was born in the kind of late 1800s, died, I think, in 1976 or 78. It wasn't like he didn't do a 9 to 5 job and then would go away on holiday for 4 weeks he was just, his life was get up in the morning, practice, see patients, and that was it, just every day for his life. And he would see 200 to 300 patients a day, and he could do that because of the pulse system they learned. A patient would sit down, they would say, what's wrong with them? I have a headache, I have, bleeding in my stool or something. He would take the pulse, ask 1 or 2 clear questions, and then say the formula to one of his students. They would go off a mixed formula. Next patient would sit down. And it was just that every day in, day out. Dr. Zeng learned that system from Dr. Yen just by sitting in clinic with him, which is a very traditional way. And then Arnaud learned that from Dr. Zeng, again, just sitting in clinic with him, seeing patients. Arnaud then kind of realized, this, in many ways, that is one of the best ways to learn this, but it's really not practical nowadays, especially in the West. You just can't sit in clinic with somebody for, 5 to 15 years exclusively. And also it doesn't really fit the way we're generally educated in the West. We're just not taught like the monkey see, monkey do kind of learning, which I think is actually, there needs to be like, we need to do a little bit more just learning in Chinese, just learning and memorizing, not exclusively, but there needs to be a bit more of that definitely in Western education. But also he realized that's very small scale production. So unless people are very, very spread out now. So people, unless it's somebody just in your local town who wants to learn from you, you can't teach that way really. So his teacher, Dr. Zeng, didn't give him long theoretical lectures, but he did point him in the right direction of where the theory lay. So through looking at the Shang Han Lun, through looking at the Neijing, he started to really piece together the theory and develop a course which actually taught the theoretical foundation of the Tian lineage, alongside very, very extensive clinical training where we do just see patients and just learn the pulse system. So that was kind of how we sort of teach it now. We teach the theoretical model and the practical application of the pulse all together. But the really key thing is that the fundamental foundation of the Tian lineage is that pulse system and is the clinical practice. And all the theory we talk about is not, we're not scholars in the sense that we'll just pore over books. And I think that's a very, very valuable pursuit. And I think there are a lot of people out there who are exceptional scholars, but we are what we call kind of clinical theorists, in that we really look deeply into theory, but only ever in service of our clinical practice.
What are the most useful ideas that you found that are in service of that clinical work then?
So, I mean, it comes back again to this idea of basic yin-yang theory, 5-element theory, and 6 conformation theory, which are, again, the classical kind of rules of how the universe works. And from a Chinese medical perspective, the human body is seen as a microcosm of the universe. You talk about as above, so below. As things happen in the outside world, that's so the fundamental mechanisms in the body, they basically all function according to the same laws. And this will sound very, very abstract, I think, to patients. This is why it takes quite a bit of training to really understand this. It's less woolly than it sounds. But basically, these fundamental yin-yang theories, it helps you develop a very, very good functional understanding of how the body works. But this runs all the way through, right to your clinical practice. The formulas you prescribe can be absolutely broken down according to the same fundamental theories as you would understand the disease in the body, as you would look at the interaction of the body with the outside environment. So those key principles are the same all the way through, from the most overarching understanding of the function of the human body, right the way through to the exact herbs you prescribe. And also the way the pulse presents and so on. It runs all the way through. So you have such a clear, consistent theoretical model, which means when you prescribe something in clinic, you know exactly what you're trying to do in the body, and therefore you can really clearly understand the feedback of that treatment.
So I think this brings us to the question that I've been wanting to ask for years, and so is Yassin, and I think I'll let Yassin ask it. If we take one of those ideas as an example, to see why it's so helpful clinically. Yassin?
Well, I presume we found our way to the idea of conformations.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. No, so perhaps just to sort of kick it off, this theme is maybe if you could, in a sentence or two, give us a very brief definition of what a conformation is exactly.
Yeah. Again, like, these are all brilliant questions because they're so they take in so much. It's really good. I've got to preface this by saying the 6 conformations, like Liu Jing, there's many different translations of this, and many people use different translations. Conformation is just a translation we settled on, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But some people call it, 6 channels, 6 divisions. There's many, many different translations, and people understand this theory in different ways as well. Some people just see it as a pairing of channels within the body. Other people just see it as pure different disease differentiation. If you have these symptoms, you have a Taiyang disease, and that's it. So the way people understand and use it go from very, very narrow to very broad. And we personally use this in a very, very broad manner. I tried to think in advance, like, how would I sum up what is a conformation in a sentence? And I'd say basically, and I'm going to have to elaborate on this later, but I'd say that basically a conformation, you could, or at least a conformation, the way we understand it, is a certain fundamental stage in the waxing and waning of yin and yang, and then everything that conforms to that within the body and in the outside environment.
Okay.
So I can basically say again, it's a certain fundamental stage in the waxing, waning of yin and yang, and everything that then conforms to that. And I'll need to elaborate on that. So then we get into the idea of.
I can tell from the look in Yassin's face that he's just about to ask you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean it's the everything that then that conforms to that or that, yeah. Yes, could you perhaps elaborate on that point, and even tell us how that plays out practically and even physiologically?
Yeah. I mean, that's a large part of our training.
I mean, first of all, just so that I don't forget,
Yeah.
I've heard that question asked, maybe not as stringently to a lot of classical Chinese thinkers.
Mm.
And I have to say, it was a deliberately difficult question because people have failed to answer it in a way that I'm capable of understanding it. But this was the best attempt yet. So
thank you. I'll see if I can explain that attempt now.
Yeah.
So yeah, this all comes back to what I was saying about yin yang theory, from this idea of something. Tao Te Ching says, what is it like from the Tao comes to one, from one comes to two, from the two comes to three, from the three comes to 10,000 things. So, from the Tao comes something, from something, if there's something, it can be divided into the two extreme poles of yin and yang. So 6 conformations comes out of yin yang. So we can say that one of the ways you understand yin yang theory is then by dividing that into 5 and 6. So 5 is the 5 elements, which you talked about before, the two opposing poles of yin and yang, fire and water, then the movement from fire to water and the movement from water to fire, and the central point around which that moves. So that's the division of 5. And we'll talk a bit later about how these two things are paired. The other one is the division into 6. And this is the 6 conformations. Now, originally, this was kind of a model of 4. So first of all, you divided into yin and yang, and then you'd have what was known as Xiao Yang or Young Yang, and Lao Yang or Old Yang, and Xiao Yin, Young Yin, and Lao Yin, Old Yin. What this basically meant was, and this is a dynamic model, it's describing the constant change between yin and yang. So first of all, you start with the small amount, which is Xiao, Young Yang, Xiao, a little bit of Yang, and then that grows and grows to Old Yang, Lao Yang, which is its maximum peak. And once something has reached its peak, the only way is down. So then yin has to grow. So then you start off with a little bit of yin, which is Xiao Yin or Young Yin, baby yin, and that grows to Lao Yin, which is Old Yin. So that originally started as a model of 4, but the problem was there was no stage to describe the decline of yin or yang. So then it became 6, which is where you get, well, for a start, Lao changed, it started being called Tai, great yang or great yin rather than old. But then the other 2 conformations came in. That's how you got to the number of 6, because you have a small amount, which is Xiao, a little amount, and then you have Tai, which is the big amount. It's grown to the larger possible amount, and then it starts to decline. And then it declines to the point where it is actually no longer predominantly yang, and it flips to yin, which is now little yin, and then it grows to big yin, and then that starts to decline until it declines to the point where it's no longer predominantly yin, and it flips to yang. And that's what gives you your 6 conformation. It's basically sort of a little bit of yin or yang, a lot of yin or yang, and kind of in between, which is kind of like not a massive amount, not a little amount. So the smallest possible amount you can have while still being yang is Xiao Yang, and then the biggest possible amount is Taiyang, and the in-between amount. So it's basically a quantification of yin and yang. And
so if we pause right there for a second, I'm gonna say something, and then you can tell me that I'm completely wrong. If we think, for example, about me just waking up in the morning, so when you're saying basically, we start off, say, with yang, we start off with a little bit of a particular type of energy or a particular type of process or a particular whatever, right? And as the day goes through, the amount of that intensifies or grows. I might wake up, I don't know if this is the case, but I'm saying I might wake up with a little bit of energy and wakefulness. And as the day goes, there's more and more of that. And then at some point it reaches its peak and it begins to turn, and it becomes less and less of that thing until I go back to sleep. At sleep, there should be more yin, more rest, more passivity, more whatever, until we get to a certain point. I reach the peak of my rest, and then I begin to slowly come out of my sleep or whatever. Is that the kind of process that we're talking about?
That's exactly it. So that's exactly right. And that's a very, very good way of looking at it. The cycles of the day, the cycles of the year, the cycling in a human being. Because again, that shows that the cycling of yin and yang in a year is exactly the same as the cycling of yin and yang in a day. It's just happening on a shorter time frame. And a human being, when in physiology, should fit with that perfectly. So yeah, that's exactly it. So we can say, looking at the sun rising and falling, at night it's in a yin state. But as you get more and more towards the dawn, so if you've got the Earth here and you've got the sun coming up over the horizon, And this is another very good example of looking at things relative to one another. Like we know from a Western scientific perspective, the Earth moves around the sun. But from our perspective, we are fixed in our central point and the sun is moving around us. We know it's us that's moving, really, but from our perspective here, from this model, we're looking at the sun moving around us because relative to the fixed point of us, the sun is moving around. But that's just an aside. That's another way, you can look at the Western Chinese comparison.
Right. It's also more practical from the kind of medicine that you're doing, just because the effect that's happening to you is tracked according to that cycle of, is the sun up in the middle of the sky or down near the western horizon, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, kind of getting back to the cycling of yin and yang. So we can say, if this is the Earth, while the sun is rising, but still underneath the horizon, hasn't popped over the horizon yet, that's still a yin state, but it's a small amount of yin. Yin is decreasing. So that's little yin. As soon as the sun pops just over the horizon, you get this little bit of sunlight. That's then Xiao Yang. You've switched to a yang state, but it's a little bit of yang. You don't want a massive amount of yang there. That would be bad. The sun then rises during the day until it reaches its peak at midday. That is then the biggest expression of yang. That's Taiyang, big yang. And then the sun starts to set, which is yang declining, until it reaches that point where it just goes below the horizon. You flip from yin to yang. Then you come out, at Xiao Yin, and then you get to big yin, which is the depths of night, and then yin starts to decline. And that's exactly how the human body should work. All of your yang should be deep on the inside at night. You should not be conscious. Your body temperature drops. Your body doesn't move very much. You are asleep. And then it gets towards the day, you start to wake up gradually. And then as soon as your yang starts to move out into your periphery, your eyes open. And this process is described in the classics. The eyes open, but you should wake up gradually. You shouldn't suddenly be wide awake and jumping out of bed. That would show pathology. Just as if you didn't wake up, if you couldn't really wake up and you stayed in bed, you felt freezing cold, you felt exhausted, that would be the opposite pathology. So you should gradually wake up during the day, warm up, stretch, and so on. In the morning, you feel a bit stiffer because you don't have big yang at your surface. As your yang moves outwards, your body starts to warm up. You start to wake up more. And then, at the peak of the day, you should be fully awake and function. I mean, you should be fully functional before that, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Then as the day goes on, you should start to wind down. Again, it's same with our circadian rhythms. You want to be exposed to less bright sunlight at that time because certain processes happening. So your body is starting to calm down and get ready for sleep. And that's the same thing, this cycle of yin and yang. And that's the conformations are just describing certain key points along this way. The broadest possible points of the littlest amount of yang while it's still being yang, the biggest amount of yang, and then the decline before it flips to yin. So it's a division. There's 6 because it's yin and yang, so there's 2. And within yang, there's 3 points, the littlest amount, the biggest amount, and the decline. And in yin, there's, again, 3. There's the littlest amount, the biggest amount, and then the decline. And this is called, this is described as opening and closing and pivoting, which you will hear when people talk about 6 conformations, Kai He Shu, or open, close, and pivot. Pivoting means a switch from one to the other. So the switch from yin to yang. So the sun popping above the horizon is yin pivoting to yang. So little yang pivots, Xiao pivots because it's that switch from yin to yang. Big yang opens, which means it's the fullest opening, the fullest expression of yin or yang. And then there's the closure, which is the decline of yang before it pivots and becomes the other. And that's what opening, closing, pivoting. And it's describing that constant cycle of yin and yang. And a conformation, what we talk about as 6 conformations, is just clear points, clear defining points along that pathway.
I heard you once talking about cinnamon, about guizhi. And you described this process of how guizhi works, right? The heart, and then it pushes things in the intestine. I won't spoil the story, but somewhere near the end of describing that process, in a kind of throwaway comment, you said, and that's really what Taiyang is. Yeah. And I thought, oh, that's actually kind of mind-blowing. Would it be okay just so that we can have an example? I think I understand, Yassin, I don't know how you're doing. I think I understand in relation, Yassin's giving us a thumbs up. Okay. So I think that I think we both understand, here you are, you're a person, here's the world. There's this very basic idea of something waxing and then a turn and then something waning and something else waxing. Um, can you, let's just take Taiyang, because I've heard that before from you, and explain, physiologically like that, like Yassin said, what is that process of Taiyang in my own body inside? What is it? Like, what's happening there?
Yeah. So Taiyang is basically about the expression of yang at the surface, like the fullest expression of yang at the surface of your body, which can be both, when it's happening properly, it's physiological. It's the blood being able to get to the tissues and the surface of your body to warm it function. That's basically it. So say if you are, before exercise, you warm up to induce Taiyang, so you don't have muscle stiffness. That's probably a good way of thinking about it. Like when you wake up in the morning, you feel stiffer. So you do a little bit of light exercise to get more blood pumping to the periphery of your body. And therefore you warm up and you're achieving Taiyang. Now you can get to a point pathologically, two things can happen. Either you cannot achieve Taiyang, insufficient blood doesn't circulate to the surface of your body. And that somebody may feel very, very cold, may even start to have body pain and body aches and so on. Or it can happen too much where it's almost like Taiyang stays open. There's too much yang constantly at the surface of your body. You're very, very hot, sweating all the time and so on. And yang is basically constantly staying up and out. That would then actually be an issue of yangming, of not closing, of not declining of yang. So, that then becomes another pathology. But that's kind of how it can go wrong.
I find that's really interesting, because that, I think, also for me clarifies how those two things are in sync with each other, right? The sun is coming up. You've just been lying still. All that blood, your circulation is, and that correlates, right? During that yin period, your body is doing yin things, and those yin things are very concrete. Has to do with your circulation, for example. Your circulation is kind of quieting down. You wake up. When the sun is at its highest, that's when the most heat. I suppose that's also just physiologically when your body's circulation would find it most easy to come to the surface.
Yeah.
Okay. And so then for the other conformations, Yang Ming, Shaoyang, these are all ways in which there are sort of patterns in the body that are related, or processes in the body that are related, that relate the different parts of your body in certain ways.
Yes. Yeah, so this is basically when I said at the start, it's basically a fundamental stage in the wax waning of yin yang and everything that conforms to that. This is where we get into it. We're talking about the physical structures, the organs, which provide the structure for these functions to happen. So, for example, from a Chinese medical perspective, the development of Taiyang, development of warm blood circulation in the body, occurs through the generation of blood at the lower. So the small intestine, the Taiyang small intestine, the paired yang organ of the heart, which is the most yang organ in the body, the paired yang organ in the heart, supplies warmth to the bladder, which then basically steams water into the bloodstream through the bone marrow to generate blood. That's a Chinese medical understanding of the process of blood. Now, obviously, again, for the people who aren't trained in Chinese medicine, this will sound a bit weird. When we talk about organs like bladder, small intestine, we're talking about something generally not necessarily exactly the same as the Western medical understanding. So again, it's this idea of a broad function. It means so much more than the term bladder, would to a Western medical practitioner, and something different as well. But basically, it's that steaming of water into the bloodstream at the lower to generate warm circulation of peripheral blood. So when we say the Taiyang conformation, everything that correlates with it, it is the expression of yang at the surface, but then it's also the circulation of blood below the surface, because Taiyang is rich in blood with little g. It's then the paired organs of bladder and small intestine and their channels in the body. And then because of that, they're paired yin-yang organs, so kidney and heart, and the tissues associated with them, such as the bone. So it's everything that kind of conforms to that sort of function. When we teach in Germany, they don't really have the word conformation in their language, so they use the word constellation instead, which is also a very, very good translation. You know, it's the idea of separate things which are all kind of tied together to create a sort of bigger sort of whole, which all have some kind of relationship. Yeah. So this is, again, like I say, the Chinese medical language is quite metaphorical and quite poetic in a way. You have one statement which can mean so many different things in relation to each other. So when you say Taiyang, when you're talking about it in terms of the outside environment, you mean cold in the outside environment. When you say Taiyang in the body, you're talking about the cold water and the interaction between the heat of the small intestine and the cold water to generate blood, i.e. warm yang, heat contained within a liquid, which is what blood is, because we're warm-blooded creatures. You're talking about the channels, the pathways along which they run, such as the back, which again, from classical Chinese thought, the cold, which is the most damaging external influence to a man, especially pre-modern man when there wasn't shelter and so on. Cold comes from behind, comes from the north. And classically, you know, that it's said that the sage faces south. People, when orientated right, are facing south. And again, that's a bigger philosophical idea than actually physically standing facing south. It means your physiology is properly aligned. Basically, cold comes from behind and below. So you have that Taiyang channel on the back, which is massive circulation of blood, warm blood to protect you from the cold of the external environment. So when you say Taiyang, it correlates with all of those things in the body. All of those things conform to the idea of Taiyang. So that's why we say it's such a broad thing. It's everything that conforms to that.
I'd like to follow up with a question regarding the difference between the biomedical understanding of organs in the body, because we've touched on the classical understanding of organs in this in your answer just right now. So what could you tell us, right, perhaps briefly? I'm not sure how much you would need to say to make it clear, but what could you tell us about the difference between biomedical and classical understandings of organs?
Yeah. So in many ways, this is a difficult thing to say because it's like because we've grown up with the understanding of the biomedical organ, I would say put that out of your mind completely, but that's impossible because that just is what's ingrained in our mind. And this is the problem for the new Chinese medical student as well, often. Classically, it's always looking at function. And the terms which were translated as liver, spleen, so on, were not necessarily even intended to fit with what the biomedical organ was. So that's kind of the thing there. But say when we're talking about liver in Chinese medicine or in classical Chinese medicine, we're talking about the wood element. So liver and gallbladder, the wood element, everything that correlates with that. So wood is to do with the movement from water to fire, from the extreme pole of yin to the extreme pole of yang. So when we're talking about wood or liver in Chinese medicine, you're talking about anything rising within the body, especially anything rising within the what we call the solid realm or the closed off blood circulation. Because of that, we're also talking about the storage of blood, the holding of blood in the correct pathway and anywhere where blood is stored. And in a pathological sense, when blood gets stuck and dries out, you know, when small capillaries break and actually harden, there's actually what we call blood stasis. It correlates with very much the eyes, the small circulation into the eyes and so on. So it's very much more of a functional correlation than what would be considered the biomedical organ now. And when, you know, if somebody came in to the clinic with a liver problem from a biomedical perspective, you may not diagnose that as a liver problem from a Chinese medical perspective because it could fall under a different functional sphere, basically. Yeah, it's just a very different concept where there are some crossovers in some senses, but not in others. You know, and some of them correlate much more closely. Like the idea of the large intestine very closely correlates. The idea of the small intestine quite different. You know, the idea of the liver again quite different. Even the idea of the spleen, like somebody could have their spleen or gallbladder removed physically, but the function, which we would refer to as spleen or gallbladder, is still something that's going on in that person's body. It's not necessarily related to the physical organ in that sense. It's just we just use those terms for the function. In many ways, it would be even easier, but would then also appear more mystical, you know, if we just used completely different terms.
It's, I mean, I think we're going to get into a little bit this kind of integration with Western medicine or biomedical medicine later. I, as a patient, have found this very interesting for a very long time.
Hmm.
At some point, it became a big thing, you know, and I started seeing it just, you know, on my news feed in Google or whatever. This kind of microbiome idea, and the idea that somehow there's a relationship between what's happening in your gut and what's happening in your brain and depression.
Hmm.
Which, when I was a young man, that was an utterly ludicrous idea.
Yeah.
Like it was just, but I remember when I first came across Chinese medicine and other kinds of actually herbalism from different parts of the world. I don't, that must be the most ubiquitous idea in traditional medicine, like on the face of the planet, that there's a relationship between what I guess in Chinese medicine you would refer to as that function of the spleen.
Hmm.
Um, and certain sort of emotional disorders, you know, and it's just been a very, very fascinating explanation, I think, like, to hear from you now, this kind of conversation about the Taiyang and the relationship between these different organs and the processes happening in the body concretely which produce those effects, you know.
Hmm.
uh, that's been a lot of fun. Okay, I'm starting to get a little bit more of a sort of idea. We've talked about the broad differences between Chinese medicine, TCM, and Western medicine. We've talked a little bit about the ideas of the Tian lineage or classical medicine in general, of how these things fit with each other. And we've talked a little bit then about how concretely, we've given an example of how concretely those things are happening in the human body. We've said the Taiyang, there's a relationship between your heart, your liver, your blood, and how it circulates and where it goes. And okay, how has this helped you? And this will be the last question for this session, because I think it's a good, you know, we've been coming towards this for a while.
Hmm.
How has it helped you clinically to be able to deal with things which you might have found confusing in your first years as a Chinese medicine student? And I'm thinking about two particular patterns, but please feel free to add a third if it was something that you found difficult. One is these seemingly simple cases, you know, which I would just pick up a book on Introduction to Chinese Medicine, and it would be like, oh, if you have a digestive issue, that's a spleen issue. If you have a spleen issue, you give a spleen tonic formula, and then that's done. And
Hmm.
that's not been the case. I will leave everything up to you, but I'm the authority on being sick. So that has not helped. And the
Hmm.
other one is, you know, you patients who come in and they've just got an enormous number of complaints. It's a very complicated chronic issue. And that must be very difficult to diagnose. It must be very difficult to sort of look and say, this is what's going on. And so I think there's often a temptation to say, well, there's 15 things going on in layers, and maybe chase those layers and not quite resolve any of them or something like this. Has this classical approach, thinking about the conformations, thinking about all these other things, helped you gain an insight into the process of disease in your patients? And what is that?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely helped. I think to sum up how it's helped, and something which I didn't find with TCM, is it's really given a great degree of clarity, you know, a really clear, methodical way to assess patients. And this is with or without a Western medical diagnosis as well, just a way to really understand patients according to Chinese medical principles. Yeah, how to understand them according to fundamental yin-yang theory, how that divides into 5 elements, 6 conformations, how their whole body is functioning and how it's disrupted, regardless of their Western medical diagnosis.
Is there an example that you can think of a patient that you've had, and maybe try to cast your mind back to the difficulty of addressing this particular patient before, and then how you dealt with this patient from the perspective that you have now? Is that a difficult question?
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe one or two examples I can think of. That kind of the problem is I studied TCM. I started practicing it kind of a bit, but as soon as I was in clinical practice, I'd already, done some practice in, in student clinics and so on. But I started studying classical medicine straight out of the gate because I had already seen what I felt were the things that didn't satisfy me in TCM. So I didn't have a lot of before and after, but what I did have a few patients when I was already working like in the student clinic and looking at certain things where I wasn't satisfied with how they were analyzed, definitely. So I can give kind of examples of what I'd maybe seen, like there, yeah. Yeah, there were a few kind of examples. One which springs to mind of a patient, and this really has cast my mind back to my student days. And this is actually even before I met Arnaud. Like one thing I noticed a lot in, again, I'm not trying to knock TCM, but one thing I noticed a lot is that there is often when a patient walks in with a certain biomedical condition, they are then given a certain Chinese medical diagnosis, whether they present that way or not. I remember one patient which always stuck in my mind, and it's just it's all of these things just help me just kind of fall out of love with TCM basically and move towards a classical model. But I remember like a patient came in, she was a young woman, on the overweight side, complained of fatigue, feeling very cold, poor digestion with low appetite, loose bowels, bloating. She had a very kind of weak voice. Hands and feet felt cold. On taking the pulse, like we all saw the patient as a group and we all agreed the pulse was deep and faint. So it's basically the most perfect display of what you would call yang deficiency, which you talk about basically a lack of function in the body, a lack of warming, a lack of kind of motor force behind all the processes in the body. Now, she got up to leave the room, and I still remember this. When she got to the door, she turned around and said, "Oh yeah, I forgot to say, my doctor says I've got a slightly overactive thyroid, but it's not worth medicating." And then she left. And then the lecturer at the time turned to us and said to all of us as students, "So what was your diagnosis?" And we're like, "Well, this is, clearly yang deficiency. It's every sign in the book is there of yang deficiency." And the lecturer's like, "Well, no, she has an overactive thyroid, so this is yin deficiency." And gave her a formula which just full of heavy, sticky, cooling yin tonics. And it was just like, really? Because she mentioned her doctor, said she had a slightly overactive thyroid that wasn't worth mentioning. Now, since then, if there's one disease or one category of disease which I feel immensely confident treating its thyroid issues, especially like autoimmune thyroid issues, and so many patients where I completely disagree with the premise that somebody with an overactive thyroid is yin deficient. But especially in that patient, I don't know how you could ever reach that conclusion. I've treated so many people where they've been able to reduce their thyroid medication and even come off it. And I've even seen people where, autoimmune thyroid conditions have gone. Now that is long-term treatment, admittedly, and I don't expect it to go in every patient, but I've seen that go. And I've never treated a single one of them as yin deficient. But in modern TCM, often if you are said to have an overactive thyroid, you are yin deficient, whether you present as that or not. And there are a few other patients that stuck in my mind like that as well. I remember we saw one patient, and this is another classic, it's a big bugbear of mine, which is menopause. Like menopausal hot flush and so on are seen as yin deficient. We won't get into why I really disagree with that and why I have so much clinical evidence also that it's not, and classical textual evidence that it's not yin deficiency. Because any heat that comes and goes cannot be yin deficiency for a start. It has to be a constant heat. Mixtures of heat and cold are not yin deficiency, but let's not go down the route. Like this was a patient who came in with menopausal hot flushes. A woman of about 50, and this was even before I'd started practicing classical medicine again. She was quite overweight, and I only say that because like a lot of times I don't really look at body types as much, but in TCM they'll often look at that as a constitutional thing, and they'll often see, if you're bigger, carrying more adipose tissue, that's often seen as more damp and more yin. If you're thinner, skinnier, more yang, lacking yin. So this is somebody who's quite overweight. They complained of menopausal hot flashes, and especially heat at night and difficulty sleeping. and a lot of digestive issues again, a lot of bloating, a lot of low appetite, loose stool. And then we all took her pulse, and like the groin positions, the middle position, showing the digestive aspect really stuck out. And me and one of my fellow students started talking, saying, surely this is a blockage in the center, which was, you know, affecting the downward movement of yang, and then it was coming up and out. And, you know, I later, upon studying classical medicine, realized this is actually a very big, prominent problem. But at the time, again, we were told, no, this is yin deficiency because it's menopause. And she is given a really strong yin tonifying form, which means a lot of very nourishing herbs, which if you've got, you know, issues with digestion, that's going to be difficult. Loads of yin tonifying herbs. And then within this formula, loads of damp draining herbs were added to help her digest it, which is already a clue that if you're having to alter your formula so the patient can digest it, that's probably not the right formula. And we can talk about this later when we talk about classical forms, about modifying and why we have certain rules around modifying. And then this patient came back a month of bulk herbs, and it was like, how are your hot flushes? And, you know, how is your hot flushes in your sleep? Maybe a bit better. And it's very, very kind of like, maybe, I don't know really. And the one thing I look for in clinic is a definite. And if a patient says maybe, and I'm saying, then that's not a definite. I consider that no result, basically. The patient has to say, yes, this is definitely better. Even if it's like, yes, it's only 10% better, but I can definitely say it's 10% better, then, you know, obviously you want more than that. But it's like maybe it's a bit better, but I've been really bloated and can't digest it. And the conclusion of the lecture was, this is the right treatment. We just need to add more damp draining herbs. And it's like, no, this you're fitting her into this box because she's menopausal. So, you know, from a TCM perspective, menopause is yin deficient, regardless of how the patient presents.
So those are actually, for me, those are actually really great examples, because you know, what I find fascinating, and I think this is the case, you know, I mean, like I said, I actually have, there's a lot of people that I know, they've gone to TCM practitioners. That particular practitioner has been very good and have happened, you know, so we're just talking in theory now. You know, theoretically, there's, you know, menopause, theoretically in TCM, it is possible for that to be the result of more than one pattern.
Yeah. Correct? Yes.
So for you, though, specifically, something like menopause, you know, could you walk us through just briefly the possibilities, right? So instead of doing this knee-jerk sort of reaction and saying it's menopause, it must be yin deficiency, what would you think about? Or it seems like you have a lot of experience treating that kind of thing. What have you found that it often is?
Yeah. I mean, obviously we should say we're talking about like discomforts around menopause, because menopause itself isn't a disease. It's like a natural process to go through. But then when there are discomforts around that, the most typical one, you know, representative ones would be hot flushes, sleeping issues, you know, waves of heat, that kind of thing. Now, the representative pathology for this in the Jing Gui Yao Lue is blood stasis. And it says this explicitly in chapter 20 of the Jing Gui Yao Lue. Chapter 22 of the Jing Gui Yao Lue. You know, it says a woman of about 50 who has diarrhea 10 times a day, vexing heat of the hand palms, you know, heat at dusk and so on, dry cracked lips. What is this? The master says this is blood stasis that was left behind some point mid-delivery. How do you know this? Because the lips are dry and parched. And when Jing Tang governs. So he says it's blood stasis that is the root of the pathology. And I've got to completely agree with that. Like the fundamental, the representative pathology is blood stasis. That doesn't mean every patient is treated that way. You treat the patient they present, but the representative pathology there would be blood stasis, because it's the menopause is the natural cessation of the menstrual cycle. Blood stasis would be a disruption of that. Now, classically, it says blood stasis left behind some point mid-delivery, because, you know, 2,000 years ago, most women would have started having children from a very young age. Blood stasis would have come out through that. Nowadays, it can be any disruption of the menstrual cycle which leads to blood stasis. Now, why does that create an alternating heat? Well, for a start, yin deficiency is not going to create an alternating heat, because yin deficiency means there's insufficient water to control fire on top. There's insufficient kidney water to control the heart on top. The heart is a steady fire. It has to be. That is your source of life. So if that heat is coming and going, you're either saying the heart's coming and going, which means your source of fire is coming and going, which obviously isn't happening because you're staying alive, you know, in the simplest possible sense. then you're saying either your kidney water is coming and going, which then isn't a true yin deficiency. No. Second thing is, if you a yin deficiency has to be a full body heat. So if you don't have enough water to control fire, your whole body is glowing hot. A low level heat, admittedly, but it won't be confined to one location because the whole cooling mechanism of your body is insufficient. So it's basically your whole body's going to warm up. Lastly, if you have sweats along with that, and I know not every menopausal woman does, but if you have sweats, you can immediately discount yin deficiency, because yin deficiency means you have insufficient water for your body to cool down. Sweating is the process of your body cooling down through the water layer. You're using water to vent heat outward. So if you are consistently sweating, you definitely have enough fluids. There's something else which is why you're constantly heating up. So an alternating heat is a problem of ministerial fire, not imperial fire. So it's a problem of Jue-yin and the blood. Now, the representative pathology for menopause is blood stasis, which means that the blood in the lower has become cold and got stuck. So then sufficient blood isn't being ascended to the pericardium to moderate the fire of the heart. That's not a problem of the kidneys not controlling the heart. It's not a problem of the heart. It's a problem of the pericardium getting dry around the heart, because there's blood stasis in the lower, so blood can't be moved up. So you've got to remove that stasis in the lower so blood can be built and moved up to the pericardium. The other thing is, again, ministerial fire. It's an alternating heat because it gains its fire from the heart. So it will flare if that fire, isn't moderated, doesn't move properly. It will flare, but then it will burn out until it's received enough fire again from the heart to actually flare again. So that's why it manifests an alternating heat. And that's also why it often manifests a heat just in one location, because it flares up and out, leaving your hands and feet cold, or it flares up so your head and your hands get warm, but your feet get cold, which is all very, very common presentations in menopause. So the representative pathology would be blood stasis, but it can be so many other things on top of that. Blood stasis is a Jue-yin issue. The excess equivalent, the excess paired conformation of Jue-yin, is Xiaoyang. So if in deficiency, it can be Jue-yin, in excess, it can be Xiaoyang. And what's the representative fever pattern of a Xiaoyang disease? It's alternating chills and fever. How does a menopausal woman often feel when she has hot flushes? She gets very hot, sweats, and then she feels very cold. She has alternating chills and fever, but on a long-term level. And I've seen so many women where you just harmonize the Xiaoyang, you remove the blockage in the Sanjiao, remove the flaring fire, and it goes. Now, on top of that, you can have so many other things as well. You can have a bit more of a Xiaoyang Yang Ming aspect. You can have people who just have a massive cold rock on the interior, so Yang floats out. So you actually just need something like a Zeng Rongxiu tank to just warm their water and root Yang. So it can be so many other things depending on how the person presents. But one thing I consistently see with treating menopausal women, when the periods have stopped and they're having hot flushes, you start to treat them. And I found they will have 1 to 3 more periods. Their periods will start again for 1 to 3 cycles, during which time they cool down, the menopausal symptoms go, and then they're generally resolved, which just confirms to me that's blood stasis. It's incomplete cessation of the menstrual period. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's the incomplete cessation of the menstrual period. It's not that they're lacking yin, and I've seen this on Xiaoyang treatments. I've seen this on warming water. I've seen this on Jue-yin treatments like Wenjing. But after that point, the hot flushes generally go. You don't have to. And one thing I've seen with the kind of treatment of menopause through yin deficiency, because I know a lot of people say, well, I do it and it works. One thing I've seen is that, if you have somebody with heat and you give them loads and loads of cooling, it will suppress their heat. Very much like if you have pain and you give somebody a painkiller, it will suppress their pain. But when that wears off, the pain will come back. It's the same thing. People have to keep taking these yin tonic forms for years, or maybe not years, but a long, long period of time. Sometimes years. It's almost like, like having to take HRT for many, many years. It's like they have to stay on these yin tonic forms for a long period of time. Whereas this resolves it. The blood moves and they resolve.
So that brings us, which is a nice, I think, way to wrap up this session. This brings us to this idea that that what you're trying to do is you're trying to aid the body into returning to what is its proper physiology, rather than addressing a symptom by like clamping down on it and making it go away.
Yes. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I'm actually quite proud of that little wrap up. It's an art. Yassin, would you like to ruin my wrap up in some way?
Heaven forfend. No. I think that was very good. Yeah. Got nothing else to say other than that makes perfect sense in terms of what you've just said about finding a way back to normal physiology. So
Okay. Laurie, thank you. That was enlightening. And we'll see you in the next installment.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it's a really, really good kind of interaction as well. I think is I actually found that considering like both you're very, very new on the path of Chinese medicine, just the way you're able to kind of grasp and really add to these concepts, brilliant. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
we'll see you in a little while.
See you then.